Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this uh, second session on instrumentation and techniques. And we have a series of interesting talks dealing with different aspects of astronomy instrumentation lined up today. So let's begin with the first talk. The first talk of the session is by Shubhadeep Day from Ayuka on optical atomic clocks to prove fundamental sciences. So Shubhadeep, are you ready with your presentation?
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Sure.
Thanks
So
for the.
I'll give you a warning, say 4 minutes before the end of 30 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Before you start, I would also like to tell all the participants here that while we will have some time for a couple of questions at the end of each of the talks, in the interest of the time, if you have further questions on any of the talks, please do go and join the Slack channel provided. And I certainly request all the speakers to join the Slack channel so that you are able to answer the questions which are put up to you, and more discussion can follow in the Slack channel. So with that preamble, Shubhadeep, please go ahead.
Yeah, so let me share the screen. Is the screen shared now?
Screen is
Do
shared, but you have to make your presentation full screen.
I already made it.
No, so we only see the slide sorter view of yours, not the.
Okay,
Uh,
so let me
yeah.
stop sharing and then do it once again. This is always. Now, do you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the kind introduction and good afternoon to everyone. And also thanks to the organizer for giving me the opportunity to speak here. Actually, I'm not directly from the astronomy community, and this is the first talk I'm giving in front of the astronomers. So let me begin. Uh, so I'm working in the area of optical atomic clock, started developing that thing at IUCA. And today I will speak about how the optical atomic clock can be used for probing fundamental science, not for the time and frequency surveys. That's not the thing what I'm going to talk about today, but about fundamental science. So I have organized the talk accordingly. So after a small introduction, I would go to the science interest that particularly we are going to have at IUCA, and what IUCA can do in its precision and quantum measurement lab that we have established here. And actually, well, it's going on, the work is going on. It's not fully established yet. So let me begin. To start the introduction or to get the ball rolling, let me start with a very basic thing. So we know that quantum mechanics was like kind of formulated about 100 year back. And in last 100 year, many things has happened. Many important discoveries has happened in science, particularly in physics. And together with that, quantum mechanics has evolved from its foundation, like let's say uncertainty principle or wave particle duality. In the mid of 90s, mankind, I mean, we actually found out the two different kind of atomic species like bosons and fermions, their nature. So BEC was achieved and fermionic condensation was achieved. And now we are in an era where this kind of quantum mechanics are actually being used to build instruments. Like, for example, the quantum computer or quantum simulator based on ion trap or atom trap or SQUID, the spin qubits, and so on. Similarly, atom interferometer or atom ultra cold atom based gravimeter, quantum logic clock or the optical clock that I'm going to talk about today, quantum communications, and so on. And all these quantum phenomena based technologies are actually emerging technologies. They are not fully established, but it has been demonstrated there are way to go forward, and the next generations will live on based on this kind of quantum technologies. So it's a very important area, particularly in India. Like we are, the entire world is going to the second quantization, second quantum revolution. So India have to come up to build this kind of technology in the country, and that also is important for future astronomy. I will cover a little bit of that. So what are the, we are going to talk about the fundamental science. So let's talk about a little bit of fundamental science, those kind of questions we may give an answer using the atomic clocks. We all know that there are four kind of fundamental forces like strong force, weak force, electromagnetic force, and gravitational force. Out of that, we have a pretty good knowledge about strong force, electromagnetic, and weak force. When I say pretty good knowledge, I mean basically like we can explain these three forces by quantum mechanics, like quantum chromodynamics or quantum flavor dynamics or quantum electrodynamics, and then basically standard model which connects these three forces: strong force, electromagnetic force, and weak force. But still there is an open thing which have not been answered so far, that is gravitational force cannot be explained by quantum mechanics yet. So there is a open or vacancy in the present knowledge of quantum mechanics. And there are many more such things, like why there is a fundamental symmetry, or why there are only six kind of quarks, and so on, several. So these kind of fundamental questions can be answered in many different ways. Astronomy is of course one thing, looking into the sky, observing and trying to find out different answers. And mankind is using astronomy for several hundreds and hundreds, or almost 1,000 years, to answer these kind of many important questions. Other areas are atomic physics and high energy physics, and also something else. So basically all these different communities, they are doing different kind of experiments to find out answers for exactly the same questions, and we have to take all these different kind of routes to make sure that the answers what is coming out is actually correct. So it's very important that we take different paths and then try to find out answers for these things. So that's what basically I said, that mankind have started basically looking at the sky very, very long time ago. That is one of the ancient thing. And then there are high energy physics experiments. So LHC can produce about like 13 tera electron volt energy, which in a controlled manner. Whereas there is another direction where people work in the area of ultra cold atoms and ions, where the temperature of this species is nanokelvin temperatures. So it's a completely two different kind of scenarios. One is at very, very high energy, and one is at very, very ultra cold or very, very low energy. Just to give you an idea or a comparison about these energies, so the Big Bang was 10 to the power 76 tera electron volt, which is of course like beyond imagination or kind of thing. In an uncontrolled manner, the Hiroshima Nagasaki was 10 to the power 20 tera electron volt energy. The CMB, of course, this community knows it very well. It's a 2.73 Kelvin temperature. So you see that the area where I am going to talk about, that is ultra cold atoms or ions, which is basically the one of the most important thing to build the optical clock, that is at much lower temperature compared to the naturally occurring temperature, lowest temperature, that is CMB. It's in nanokelvin temperatures. So let's move on to do this kind of physics to get an answer for this kind of open questions. There are several different experiments. Some of the experiments are like really, really mega science experiment that involves lot of people from different countries, different expertise like engineering, physics, astronomy, optical physics, so on. And it involves like thousands of people and so on, very big setups and etc. Like, of course, one is astronomy in radio telescopes or UV visible or X-ray telescopes or gravitational wave detectors. Then there are high energy physics experiment, for example, the Fermilab G-2 anomaly experiment or CERN. Yeah, so all these experiments, or even like neutrino detectors in Japan. So these are only few examples. There are many of such things. But the point what I wanted to make here, there is one set of experiment which involves lot of people in different areas of expertise, and it's a really big challenge to get these setups working and working with several different people also. On the other hand, there is another set of tabletop experiment, and that's mostly based on atomic physics side, atomic physics knowledge. For example, this atomic parity violation experiments. So take some some particular radionuclei, it decays to a daughter nuclei, and there is a neutrino-less beta decay, and parity violations have been observed in this kind of experiments. This is, for example, what you see the picture. This is magneto-optically trapped radioactive sodium, sodium 21, not 23. 21 is radioactive. That was happening where I did my PhD. And then it decays into daughter nuclei, and then further physics with it. Then there are electric dipole moment, permanent electric dipole moment search on some atoms. For example, this is a radium, neutral radium atom trapped in a magneto-optical trap in Argonne National Lab, and they were trying to find out whether these atoms have any permanent electric dipole moment or not. According to our standard model theory, atoms should not have any permanent electric dipole moment, but there could be violations of that. And if it violates, then it violates different kind of fundamental symmetries like time reversal symmetry or parity symmetry or CP. This is another atomic parity violation experiment in UCSB in USA, that is with radium ion. It also happened with barium ions with Norman Fortson's group. This is again a tabletop experiment, but one of the most precision experiments. And finally, the atomic clock, optical atomic clock particularly, that's what is today's focus and what we are working on now. For the optical atomic clock, it can be two different types. One is with neutral atoms, other one is could be with charged particles, singly charged ions. So this left figure with neutral atoms are cooled to almost like few tens of nanokelvins temperature, and then loaded into an optical lattice. So this is the picture of an optical lattice used to localize these neutral atoms. And then once they are localized, you probe the clock transition. Clock transition is one of the forbidden transition. That means classically those transitions are not allowed, but quantum mechanically there is some certain possibility to drive that transition. So it's not electric dipole transition. They are classically allowed, but electric quadrupole or octopole or higher order transition, which has very small strain compared to the electric dipole transitions. And then the other kind is the trapping single ion. So this is an oscillating potential, what you see here. A single ion, a particular type of ion, can be trapped in an oscillating potential, and then it can be cooled to, let's say, tens of microkelvin temperature, and then the clock transition, again, and one of the like non-allowed transitions, can be probed into that. And for ions, it has to be only single ion, because ions are charged particle. If you take multiple ions, they will have a Coulomb repulsion, and that will shift the clock transition. We want to measure the clock transition in most unperturbed way. If there is any perturbation, that will add systematics to the measurement. So for neutral atoms, you can take n number of atoms. It's basically on the order of thousands or few 10,000. The signal to noise is very large, but there the problem is multiple atoms have a collisional shift. Whereas a new charged particle, you have only single ion, so that means signal to noise is very low. Basically, signal is very low, but the charged particle can be trapped over months. Yeah, so you gain by integrating the signal, but you lose by total number of counts. So both of them has advantage and disadvantage, but both are very nice. In fact, a combination of that thing gives the enriched physics, which can be studied, and that I will be mostly, at least little bit of that I will be focusing on that part. And here you see two just pictures from GILA in USA and PTB in Germany for the strontium lattice clock and ytterbium ion clock, and we are going to develop the ion clock, ytterbium ion clock. So at this moment, the experiments, like either it's a mega science experiments or a tabletop experiments, they are not only locally done, but the next generation, or this generation actually, are going to connect several of these experiments together in a network, so that the sensitivity can be enhanced to a much bigger level. So the scopes of physics that can be studied by these things can be enormous, rather than doing it by just single one experiment at some particular location. And that networking actually, to best of my knowledge, have started with clocks, with cesium microwave clocks. Here I'm not talking about the optical clock. So there are several cesium clocks which are worldwide available. They are connected together to one particular international body called BIPM in France, and they are defining the SI second, SI definition of second. So that's what you see here, constellation of cesium clock. There are around 350 or 400 cesium clocks worldwide available, and India also contributes to that. NPL in Delhi have cesium clocks, which contributes to that. In astronomy, of course, to this community, I don't need to tell, there are VLBI, like these radio antennas, they are connected together. Then LIGO, there are already 2 LIGO, third one is going to come to India, and then Kagra and Virgo, they are all connected and looking into the same space and looking into the same gravitational waves. And there are many more. Also, UV optical telescopes are connected. In atomic physics side, few more examples. For example, these are like very precise magnetometers, optical magnetometers, and there is a consortium, worldwide consortium, they are connected. This is the atom interferometer, ultra cold atom based interferometer in UK. They are connected together, and particularly of our interest, these are the optical clock network worldwide. In USA, there are several optical clocks, and this is the European Union clock network. So the clocks are actually in Europe are available with different countries like UK, Germany, France, Italy, and few others. And these clocks are connected by ultra stable fibers. So it's not the simple optical communication fiber, but these fibers are stabilized for their length with a stability of 10 to the power minus 17 or 18 at 1 second. So it's really, really state of the art technology. It's not like sending some 15 nanometer light through simple optical fibers. And even though they use the same fiber, but then on top of that, there are additional technologies which you have to do to stabilize that fiber length. And then what is happening, you see all these dots, they're all optical clocks, and they're connected together, and they can do a comparison study for the to meet the physics goals and etc. Obviously, in India, we don't have the optical clock yet, but there are a few groups, including us, are trying to develop it. So not only building the optical clock is important, but if you want to go further, as part to the international level, dissemination of these photons with a very using ultra stable fiber, that is one of the important challenge will be also together with developing the optical clock. Present status of the optical clock, that is summarized in this table. I'm not going into detail of that, but there are 2 different kinds, as I told you, neutral atom optical lattice clock and ion clock, and they are with 2 different colors shown here, yellow and this light blue, and both of them have actually reached to an accuracy level of 10 to the power minus 19. In simple words, if I convert the stability of 10 to the power minus 19, that means if a clock is running over the edge of the universe, like let's say for 13.8 billion years, it will miss only one single tick. It will be inaccurate by only 1 second. So that kind of clock we are talking about. Obviously, those kind of clocks are not important for our daily life, but for fundamental studies, these clocks are not even good enough. So we have to think of even further better clocks. For example, here people are trying to develop a next generation clock, which is a nuclear clock. I will not talk about that thing today. What kind of fundamental physics can be probed using this kind of optical clocks, or rather in a correct way of saying optical clock comparison using these networks, let's say. For example, the constancy of the fundamental constants or fundamental symmetries, whether they're actually constants, these are considered to be constant in our standard model. But we need to test whether they're actually constants or not, because there are theoretical predictions that fundamental constants like fine structure constant may not be a constant. It has some dynamicity, but we have to test that. We do not have any measurement instrument at this moment which can measure it, but slowly things are progressing. It's becoming more and more better every years, or let's say something like that. Then geodetic measurements, like very accurate prediction of geode, it's very important, like how the dynamicity of earth is changing and etc. etc. It's very important to measure geode of an earth very accurately and how it is changing over the time. Then there are other proposals like dark matter search, gravitational wave detections. Also, there are proposals using atom interferometer and optical clocks, quantum information processing, and of course, the astronomy, like all these antennas or gravitational wave detectors, they need to connect together with a very good, I mean, they have to be phase synchronized, basically. It's not really time synchronized, but phase synchronized. But to do that, you need to generate a very ultra stable, let's say, optical reference through using which one can phase synchronize them. And that optical clock can do. For example, at this moment, the NCRA radio antenna they have installed a hydrogen measure, and using it, using this phase synchronization using microwave, the next upgrade could be using the optical reference, like an optical clock. And in Europe already there are a few people in VLPI particularly, they are using the optical clocks for phase synchronization. So it's not something like it's not happening. It's actually happening in the advanced countries, but in India it's not available. That's why probably it's not happening. At our lab in IUCAA, we are particularly interested in first three things. Once the optical clock is developed here, we want to study or put our effort to study on these first three things, and maybe something else will also come up. So I will not have time to go into these all three things in detail, but let me just pick up one particular example, and that is like local Lorentz invariance violation. And I will tell you in next few slides how the optical clock can help us. So we know what is Lorentz invariance. I'm not going into that again detail to save some time. So if it violates, that would tell us that an extension of the present standard model is required. And what the possible experiment, or actually the experiment which has happened, but that needs to be improved. Well, this is a CMB. I am not an expert of that, but I'm just showing you because this is our rest frame. Yeah, that is considered to be our rest frame. And on that, the planetary system is there. This is not a 2D scale picture. It's only to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. The Earth is rotating on that CMB background, right? So that means if you consider Earth is a rotating frame, that is rotating with respect to our rest frame. But how to do an experiment? And also Earth is also rotating around the sun. So this rotating frame is also changing over the year, over the day as well as over the year. How to construct an experiment? Because experiment will be done on Earth only. So our observer as well as the experiment both will be in the same frame. So what people have done using the clock is following. They have taken two almost identical clocks. Almost identical means they are only different by their quantization directions. So one clock, so let's say these are cats which are defining the clocks, and this is the pendulum of direction of the pendulum of the clock, which in a quantum world is a quantization axis. And this quantization axis for these two clocks are different. Yeah. Now, if there is a perturbation or if there is a correlation with the local Lorentz invariance, then there is a factor, there is a tensor, second order tensor called C mu nu, which actually connects two different reference frame that will be different for this clock and for clock 2. And if the clock is sensitive to that, then the clock frequency of these two different clocks will be changing over time. And it's called C mu nu times T. T is the quadrupole tensor. I will come to that in the next slide, it's there. So if you can measure very precisely the difference of these things, C mu nu 1, clock 1 minus C mu nu for the clock 2, multiplied by this tensor component T. So basically you measure the product of that, but since it's an identical clock, T is same for those both of the clocks. T depends on atomic properties. Both are ytterbium ion clocks, so T is constant. So that's why I'm saying you are just measuring this difference between C mu nu for two different clocks over an year. Then if the clocks are sensitive enough, then you will see a difference. This quantity is changing over an year. And that's what people have done in PTB in Germany. They have two ytterbium clocks. The picture is taken from this Nature paper. And these are the quantization directions defining by the magnetic field. And they have measured this C mu nu, delta C mu nu, let's say, over a long period of time. And ytterbium is one of the very good candidate. Ytterbium ion is one of the very good candidate for this measurement. But because for ytterbium ion, this T10 coefficient, which depends on the quadrupole moment of a particular clock state, is highest compared to all other optical clock candidates. So ytterbium is very lucrative in that sense. And that's the result that they have come up, the different components of the C mu nu tensors in the lab frame. So you see their sensitivity. This is actually, they have not measured the C mu nu directly. They have only measured sensitivity of their experiment. And this is the sensitivity of their experiments, which is much higher compared to different other experiments, including the astrophysics experiments like quasar absorption spectra. You see there it's like 10 to the power minus 15, whereas optical clock have reached to a 10 to the power minus 20 level. And there are a few other experiments like Alcatraz experiment and looking into microwave transitions of dysphorium atom. And out of all 4 different kind of experiments for this particular purpose, where there is a local Lorentz invariance or not, optical clock have reached to the highest sensitivity level. The next thing what could be done is like distribution of the clocks. Like here the clocks were in the same lab in the PTB. So next people are going to use clocks in different continent, and that's why this optical fiber network is also important. And the next step would be putting the optical clock in space. And if you want to put the optical clock in space, you have to consider the size of the optical clock. It cannot be a full lab of optics and etc. It has to be miniaturized. And one step for that is miniaturizing of the ion trap, putting everything on a chip. That is, for example, an ion trap chip that is developed in US and few other countries. Also, we also have an aim to develop this kind of chip, but one step at a time. So the next generation will be optical clock, basically on a chip, and a very compact thing which can be transported through a payload. And then probably one can reach to a sensitivity level where these local Lorentz invariants can be probed, whether it is there at all or not. So now coming to the IUCAA, we have started our lab basically just before the COVID, and it was basically almost closed, and now we are restarting again. So this is called Precision and Quantum Measurement Lab. We have 3 different particular goals in this lab. One is quantum metrology. As I told, spoke few of the applications like geodesy and etc. Precision measurements like measurements of constancy of the fundamental constants and symmetries, and also developing quantum enhanced technology which might be related to quantum communications.
Shubhadeep, 3 minutes.
Yeah, sure. So we will be doing the trapped ion clock. The ions will be trapped in an ion trap. It's called a Paul trap. Then it will be laser cooled to microkelvin temperatures, few tens of microkelvin temperatures, and then the clock transition will be probed. So this scheme setup will be involving the optical clock, then frequency comb, optical frequency comb, and stabilizing the optical frequency comb to a level of 10 to the power minus 17 or 18 at 1 second. For that, you need a commercial like radio frequency atomic clock or GPS signals that will be commercially will be using. And then reference cavity, that is very important development. So basically this A and C that will be indigenously developed at the PQM lab, and these are both of them are state-of-the-art technologies, whereas COMB and radio frequency or microwave clocks will be commercial. And then not only we'll have our physics goals, but it can help to many other experiments, including LIGO or let's say the wavelength calibration, very accurate wavelength calibration of the telescopes, optical or UV telescopes, and quantum communication, so on. As I said, the networking is important. So there are a few labs in India who are also working on optical clocks. Started basically, I mean, earlier I was at NPL in Delhi, and there I started the optical clock development before moving to IUCAA. So in future, there could be a network among these clocks, particularly in Pune. IUCAA, that's myself, and ISAR Pune, Umakant Rapol are developing 2 different clocks. They are doing strontium lattice clock. I am doing ytterbium ion clock. And we have a plan to connect this together via an optical fiber. So we can start the networking from Pune itself, and that can be a guinea pig for us before we can make a Indian network of clocks, let's say. And that can be also used for very other fundamental science experiments, which I have not spoken today. So that brings me the conclusion. So I have talked about the optical clock, why it is important. We are developing that. I have talked about the networking for different experiments, particularly optical clock, and in Pune, particularly in the city, we have a plan to do that. And in future, we also like to do the cheap ion trap, so everything can be miniaturized. It's a long-term goal. Everything cannot be done in next few years, but we are doing that. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Shubhadeep, for a very interesting talk. we have time for a couple of questions. So please raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Okay, I have one question for you. You talked about the, okay, there is a hand up. Shri Kumar, please.
Yeah, I was just, Subhadev, you mentioned the development of the ion trap. Subsequent to that, I suppose, is we're talking about the miniature ion trap. Could you give us some rough time scale over which these things could be achieved?
See, actually, thanks, Professor Kumar, for your question. So actually, see, in principle, all these three things could start in parallel. Yeah, but the only thing is there are two different things. One is the total kind of number of people who are working in this area and funding. So right now, I don't have fund to do these things, but it will take time. It will not be happening in 2 years. So in first 2 years, only the small steps of this fabrication can be done and then normalized, and then we can go for the actual fabrication for the actual cheap ion trap, and I'm sure that will be a failure. So we have to go several steps to make it actually working. So I would say it would take at least 5 to 6 years at least. And there are different people, like from fabrication to designers to simulators, everyone have to come together.
At this point, just as a follow-up, do you have any point of contact with ISRO on these matters?
No, I had a contact with Tejas Bandi, but he's not really working on trapped ion clock. But I heard there are other people in Tiruvananthapuram working in this area, but I don't have a contact. If you can help me on that thing, that would be great.
We'll discuss this offline. Thank you.
Yeah. So just to give you another comment of that, recently one of our kind of proposals have been passed in the first phase, that is called ETI, Emerging Technology Initiatives. That's an initiative by PSS Office, Ministry of External Affairs and Science Policy Forum for this particular topic. And we are collaborating with some foreign people, mechanical engineers, fabricators together. So if ISRO can come into that thing, that would be great.
Okay, thank you. We'll connect.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Shubhadeep? Yeah, so I had one question, quick question. You talked about networking locally in Pune. So is it possible for you to provide a stable reference for, say, a telescope like GMRT, which is nearby?
This is like one of the reasons why we are want to develop this networking. So once technology is developed, sure, that is one of the goals. So, but like, let's say your GMRT will be something, I don't know, 60 kilometers away from here. So you need a fiber line. Let's say the clock is
we have a dedicated fiber to Pune, which ends at NCRA.
Right. So that fiber is good to start with, but we have to stabilize the length of the fiber. That is an additional technology which we have to develop. And that's what we will first develop in our lab, and then we'll deploy. So down the line, you are right. That is one of the reasons why we want to develop this technology.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. We can discuss this offline.
Yeah, sure.
So thanks. Let's thank Shubhadeep again. The next talk is on phased segmented primary mirror using de-dispersed fringe technique by Radhika Dharmadhikari from Indian Institute of Astrophysics. So are you ready for with your presentation?
Yeah, I will share my screen.
Sure. I'll give you a warning after 10 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. While
is the screen visible?
Yeah, it is visible. While the presentation is being shared, let me also remind all the participants that there is a Slack channel where you can carry forwards the discussion in case you want. The channel is in the ASI, and within the ASI Slack, the channel is called as oral_instrumentation_and techniques. Okay, so Please feel free to post your question. And I request all the speakers to please have a look in case there is a question for them. Radhika, yes, please go ahead. I'll give you a warning after 10 minutes.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Radhika, and I'll be talking about the phasing of segmented primary mirrors using the dispersed fringe technique. And I have been doing this work under the guidance of Professor Padmakar Parihar. So following would be the contents of my presentation. So as we know, to achieve higher and higher resolution and sensitivity, we have started moving towards larger telescopes. And for that, we have adopted the segmented mirror design. But the ease of manufacturing and maintenance of segmented mirrors comes with a few challenges. And the challenge is that each of the segments should be very precisely aligned and oriented with respect to each other. So for this, three processes are involved, which are co-aligning, co-focusing, and co-phasing. And once these three are completed, there is a primary mirror control system, also called the M1CS, which is responsible for maintaining the alignment or orientation of the segments over time. So starting with co-aligning, co-aligning mainly deals with the removal of tip tilt error of the segment. So if you can see here in the figure, the center segment has a tip tilt error. So when co-aligning is done, it mainly makes all the PSFs from each of the segments to fall at a single point on the focal plane. So after co-aligning is completed, next comes co-focusing, which is basically the ROC adjustment of each of the segments such that the PSF size from each of the segments is made equal on the detector plane. And after these two processes are completed, co-phasing is taken up. So co-phasing mainly deals with the removal of height difference, which is also called piston error, which is shown here in the figure. So removal of this piston error or minimizing it is called co-phasing. And only after these three processes are completed, we achieve the desired resolution, which is equivalent to that of a monolithic mirror. So here, if we compare these three figures, the first one is the theoretical PSF for a segmented mirror telescope. Second one is the PSF for the unphased case, and the third one is for the phased case. So if we compare these two, we can see that the phased PSF is pretty much similar to the theoretical PSF, but the unphased PSF is very much distorted. So this shows the significance of phasing. Now, there are multiple phasing techniques which are currently being studied and developed by different groups. And the Keck phasing, which includes the narrowband and broadband phasing techniques, is the only phasing technique which has been successfully implemented on the Keck telescopes presently. So this picture here is showing the basic principle of the Keck phasing technique. So here the PSFs for the intersegment regions are shown. So as we see from, as we move from 0 to lambda by 2 piston error, the PSF shows a splitting. And at lambda by 4, it splits exactly into two equal halves. So this splitting of the PSF is used as a measure of piston error in the Keck phasing technique. Then apart from Keck, there are many more phasing techniques like the Zennike phase contrast sensor, OTF based phasing, cross fringe technique, and dispersed fringe sensor, also called the DFS, which I will be talking about in detail, and other many more techniques. So starting with the principle of the dispersed fringe technique, it is based on the principle of Rayleigh interferometry. So Rayleigh interferometry is used to find the optical path difference between two collimated beams. But since it uses a monochromatic source, hence its capture range is limited to lambda by 4. So to increase the capture range, DFS or DFT uses a broadband light source. So as can be seen here in the picture, this is our broadband light source. Then we have a collimator giving the collimated beam. Then these phase plates are used to simulate the effect of piston error in case of segments. Then we have the aperture stop to separate the collimated beams. Then a dispersive element like a grating or a grism is used. So this is basically used to spatially separate the different PSFs of different wavelengths on the detector plane. And it is the most important component of the DFS sensor. And then we have the camera lens, which focuses the light on the image plane. So under ideal condition, we would have a continuous spectrum like this. But in presence of piston error, this spectrum would be modulated by fringes. and the frequency and the period or the visibility of these fringes is a measure of piston error. So the DFS equation, that is the intensity variation on the image plane, is given by this equation. Here I naught is the mean intensity of the fringes, gamma is the visibility, and delta is the piston error. So here I have shown a few of the results which are obtained by different groups who have performed the DFS experiment. So the first figure is showing the results obtained by the NGST group. So this is the DFS fringe image, and this plot is showing the intensity variation along the dispersion direction. So we can see that the sinusoidal variation of the intensity is clearly seen, which is given by the DFS equation. In the second figure, these are the results obtained by the Keck telescopes, obtained at the Keck telescopes. So they simultaneously sampled the light from 12 intersegment regions, hence 12 different fringes are visible in the image. And third one are the results obtained by the JWST group who performed the DFS experiment at the Keck telescopes. So here in the first figure, they sampled the light from the intersegment regions which were at 0° orientation, and in the second one, the light is sampled from the intersegment regions which are at 60° orientation. Now, to understand the principle of DFS, we created a Python code which could simulate the DFS fringes for different values of piston errors, and we studied the various properties of DFS fringes. So if we look at the second figure here, for zero piston error, the spectrum is continuous. Then as the piston error is increasing, we can see that the fringes start occurring, and the frequency of the fringes also increases. Then the next property is the visibility of the fringes. So as the piston error increases, the visibility reduces. And also for large piston errors, we can observe, like here for 40 micron, we can see that towards the lower wavelength side of the spectrum, the visibility is lower, but towards the higher wavelength side, it's still better. So this shows the wavelength dependence of the visibility of the DFS fringes. Another property is that for opposite signs of piston error, the tilt angles are exactly opposite. So for -4 micron and +4 micron piston errors, the fringes have exactly opposite tilts. Then the most important property of the DFS fringes is that the visibility is strongly affected by the angle of orientation between the intersegment edge and the dispersion direction. So if we look here in this figure, this is the intersegment edge, and these are the area on the segments from where the light is sampled. So this is the intersegment edge, and this is the dispersion direction. So in this case, both have an angle of 0°, hence we have the highest visibility. But if we go on increasing the angle, like 10, then 20, 30, 40, 50, and 60°, then we see that constantly the visibility reduces, and for 60°, the fringes are barely visible. So this is one of the limitations of the DFS technique, which needs to be improved, because under practical case, if we consider the hexagonal segments, then we would have the intersegment regions at 0° plus 60° and minus 60°. So this would be a problem which needs to be improved. Further, we also included noise modeling in our DFS fringe simulation. So this block diagram is explaining the basic working of the simulation code. So for noise modeling, we included the effects of atmospheric extinction, photon noise, and CCD-induced noises like dark noise, readout noise. And then these are the results for the noise simulation. This is the fringe image that we obtained, and this is the plot along the dispersion direction for the intensity. So the orange one is the plot for the ideal fringe, and blue one is for the noisy fringe. So what we observe is that for the noisy fringe, there is a reduction in the intensity, but the sinusoidal variation of intensity still remains same. So noise is not creating much problem. And this is the difference plot between the two fringes. Also, we calculated the SNR for various cases of different values of the noise parameters. Like we varied the magnitude of star, then we varied the CCD exposure time, then quantum efficiency, and the CCD temperature. So the table here is summarizing the results for these different cases. and the values of SNR that we obtained were as expected. Further, the next task that we did was to extract the piston error from the generated fringe images. So usually curve fitting is used to extract the piston error from the fringe images, and the basic DFS equation, which is given here, is used for curve fitting. So we used Python based curve fitting for piston extraction. So here 3 cases of piston extraction are shown for piston of 0.5 micron, 5 micron and 40 micron. Here blue curve is the fringe data and orange one is the fitted data. And the table here is showing the original piston value and the measured piston value and the error between them. So here we can observe that as the piston error is increasing, the measurement error also increases. So one of the reasons behind that is that with increasing piston error, the visibility of the fringes reduces, and hence the fitting accuracy also reduces.
Radhika,
Then
3 minutes.
Further, we did the optical.
3 more minutes,
Yeah,
please.
2 more slides.
Yeah, sure.
We did the optical design of a multi-segment DFS instrument. So as in the practical case, we would have to sample the light from multiple intersegment regions simultaneously. So as can be seen here in the figure, the green circles are the masks to sample the light from the intersegment region, and blue one is the prism. So prisms are used to deviate the collimated beams after the mask, such that the fringes can be separated on the detector plane. So this is the basic layout of the multi-segment DFS instrument. So for the simulation, we considered the PSMT primary mirror, which is a 7-segment mirror having 1.3 meter diameter and 250 mm segment size. So this is the final layout of the instrument that we designed. This is the telescope focal plane. Then we have an off-axis parabolic mirror, which is used as a collimator so that the chromatic aberrations can be reduced. Then we have the mask prism assembly. Prisms are basically used to deviate the lights from different intersegment regions so that they can be separated on the detector plane. Then we have the grating, and then the 5-element camera lens. And finally, on the detector plane, we obtain the fringes. So since we sampled the light from 6 intersegment regions, hence here in the spot diagram, we can see that the 6 fringes are separated. And this table here is showing a comparison between the required design value and the design value that we could achieve in the design. So coming to the future work, we are planning to improve the design, optical design of the multi-segment DFS instrument, such that it can sample the light from all the intersegment regions for a 2-ring segmented mirror telescope. And also we plan to improve the DFS simulation further by incorporating the effects of atmospheric turbulence to see its effect on the visibility of the fringes. And we are also planning to perform the DFS experiment in the lab to understand its practicalities and limitations in a better way. And we have also started exploring other phasing techniques so that a better comparison between all the techniques can be made and the best one can be chosen. These are the references that I used. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Radhika. Time for a very quick question. Just one question. If anyone has, please raise your hands if you wish to ask a question. If not, let's thank Radhika, and let's move on to the next talk of the session, which is by Kushagra Upadhyay from Udaipur Solar Observatory. And he's going to tell us about Callisto and the observations of solar activity at the lower frequencies using Callisto. Kushagra, you're ready? Yeah, we can see your screen. Yeah. So I'll warn you after 10 minutes.
Okay. Myself, Kushagra Upadhyay. I am presenting observation of solar activities at low radio frequencies by Callisto at USOPRL. I am presenting on behalf of entire USOPRL Callisto team. My outlines are, I will give brief introduction, then I will present scientific objective of the Callisto, then various subsystem, then hardware configuration, and some observation that we have taken recently, and data pipeline for the PRL server, and then future prospects. eCallisto is basically a worldwide network for solar radio observation. You can see there are several sites here. Uh, Here red dots are presenting active sites, and blue dots are presenting the sites that are not working at present. Basically, Callisto stands for Compound Astronomical Low Cost, Low Frequency Instrument for Spectroscopy and Transportable Observatory. Here low frequency means we are working on 40 to 870 megahertz, that is low frequency, and transportable because it is very compact spectrograph, so it is transportable observatory. Here this is the location of Callisto site. Here you can see that this is the container where entire instrument like spectrograph, data processing computer, and some power supply and everything is located. And here it is the pole where log periodic dipole antenna is mounted. Although this instrument is very small and compact, but in terms of scientific solar phenomena, it has very great importance to understand solar activity like solar flare and coronal mass ejection. Solar flare is basically sudden brightening on the sun, and coronal mass ejection is the eruption of the plasma. When during this CME, when plasma is erupted, then when it travels through interplanetary medium, it may disrupt our satellite, our GPS signal, our power grid, and it may affect health of the astronaut. Also, with this CME and flare, in other spectra like X-ray, gamma ray, UV, radio, large energy is emitted. So this radio waves that is emitted during this solar activity may interfere the aviation sector and our ground-based communication system. So this Callisto spectrograph, it observe radio burst, and it may give early warning during this solar activity. Also, this observation of this radio burst from the Callisto can give better insight about the triggering mechanism of the flare, and to understand non-thermal plasma processes like electron acceleration, shock propagation, and plasma oscillation. This is the various subsystem of Callisto spectrograph. You can see here, this is the 4-meter long log periodic dipole antenna. Here you can see that the lowest element that is corresponding to lowest frequency, that is 40 megahertz, and the uppermost element that you can see, the thin element that is corresponding to highest frequency, that is 870 megahertz. Basically, log periodic antenna is an array. I will explain it later how we designed it. And you can see that this coaxial cable is connected to this low noise amplifier. Here this is the low noise amplifier, and later this it is connected to the our spectrograph. This is the compact spectrograph, and this is the communication system where computer where entire data is processing. In our team member at USOPRL, Dr. Bhuvan Joshi, his local PI, Dr. Ramit Bhattacharya, myself, and Prabir K. Mitra. We have collaboration from NCR Pune, Dr. Divya Obera. This antenna is designed by me, and this antenna is designed by me at USO, and it is fabricated at GMRT under supervision of Dr. Divya Obera, and from Eidsvoll, Switzerland, Christian Monstein, who is the PI of entire network. So here you can see this is the Callisto hardware configuration. Here, as I explained, the log periodic antenna that is connected to low noise amplifier. By amplifying signal, it is going to the bias T. Actually, bias T is providing power to the low noise amplifier. Then FM notch filter, because the FM interference is very high, so we used this filter. But nowadays we removed it because it was causing cross modulation in the spectra, and it was affecting our signature of the solar radio events. So nowadays we removed it and we are getting better data. So later it is connected to Callisto and data acquisition and processing system. Before going to the design, I would like to explain why log periodic dipole antenna is generally used for solar radio astronomy, because it has wide bandwidth like 40 to 870 megahertz. So you can say that it is a ratio, in 1:20, that is huge bandwidth. Then wide beam width, it has beam width approx 90 to 110 degree. So beam width is basically a cone angle of radiation pattern. So if we mount it vertical, and if beam width is approx 90 degree, then it can get better coverage of approx 6 to 8 hours. So we do not need tracking system and other mechanical complexity. Other thing is directive antenna, and its gain is about 6 to 10 dB and easy to manufacture. So here, as you can see that in log periodic dipole antenna, there is two parallel pipe. Both are in opposite phase. Okay, so here you can see these are the dipole. These dipoles are arranged in a crisscross fashion. The first dipole is connected to first pipe that is at 0 degree phase. Second dipole is connected to second pipe that is at 180 degree. Again, third pipe is connected to 0 degree phase, and fourth is connected to 180 degree phase. So this mechanical phase reversal, this provide our beam focused in a upward direction. So if phase are equal, phase are in 0 degree or 180 degree, then same, then it will provide, it will work as a broadside array. But if phase are in opposite, so this will work as an end fire array, where beam is focused in the upward direction. Now this is the design of log periodic dipole antenna. We can see here that these are the basic equation, and this is a standard mechanism to design the log periodic dipole antenna. We can see here that the length of consecutive element, ratio of the length of this consecutive element is always remain constant in the entire length, and the spacing is also in the same ratio. This is the basic principle for designing the log periodic dipole antenna. And first element is corresponding to lowest frequency, so we can calculate it by lambda by 2. Okay, so here you can see Li plus 1 equal to 2 Li. This tau is the ratio, and this ratio can be selected by from this plot. We can see that tau is the design constant. As per our requirement of the gain, we can select tau and sigma, and at low frequency the gain is approximately 8 dB, and it is sufficient to observe solar event. So we have taken approximately 8 dB gain and corresponding tau and sigma. After that we have modified our antenna, log periodic dipole antenna. So here actually as I explained, that length are decreasing because it is in the ratio. So our purpose to design antenna is to reduce VSWR. Okay, so here and VSWR depend on the impedance mismatch. Okay, so every dipole has impedance depend on the L by D ratio. We can see that impedance depend on the L by D ratio. As length is decreasing, then we need to decrease our diameter to maintain this impedance constant in the entire length. So as length is decreasing, we reduce our diameter. But in the market, we do not get every diameter pipe. So we took 6 type of pipe, 6 diameter pipe. L1 to L4 is 25 mm, then L5 to L7 is 19.5 mm, and so on. And we improve our VSWR performance. Later, this is the specification. As I explained, that frequency range is 40 to 870 megahertz and gain is approx 8 to 9 dBi. Beam width is 90 to 110 degree, as I explained, and that beam width is 90 degrees. So we do not need tracking system because we are getting 6 to 8 hour good coverage. VSWR is good, that is below 2, and number of elements are 28, and some other mechanical parameter as that length of each boom is 3.63 meter. So approx length of the antenna including stub is 4 meter. These are the specification of the spectrograph. This you can see, this is the frequency agile radio spectrograph that we got from the Christian Monstein. Actually, this spectrograph is tuning every frequency in 0.25 seconds. So time resolution is 0.25 seconds. Frequency is 45 to 870 megahertz, and number of channels are 200 frequency channel. So here, if we see that if we are taking entire band 45 to 870 megahertz, then our resolution will be approx 4 megahertz. But this frequency resolution is the maximum frequency resolution. If we reduce our frequency range, then we get better frequency resolution. Other
Kushagra, three minutes, three more minutes.
Okay. These are the solar plasma radiation that we observed at USOPRL. These are the RFI plot that we measure for the calibration, that whether our system is working fine or not. So these are the standard signal that we identify that we are getting in a better strength, so our system is working fine. So these are some preliminary observation. Although solar activities are at very low, because it is the minimum phase, but we are getting very good signature. These are the type 1 storm. These are the type 3 radio event on 6 May, and recent observation has been improved. We can see here, these are the high resolution images on 30 December and 28 December. These are just A class and approx A and B class flare. So we can imagine that in very weak event, we are getting solar radio burst. These are other events on 28 July 2020, and this is nicely observed event on 30 December. We have our website where data is uploading in every 15 minutes. As data is generated, it is uploading on the server and we can download it from here. These are for scientific analysis. We have FITS file, and and we have JPEG file for the quick view whether there is an event or not. So for more information, you can visit here on this website. And this is our future prospect that we are planning. We are planning to make our wideband, and initially we are making high resolution wideband spectrograph, FFT spectrograph, where it will provide enhanced capability than the existing spectrograph. Like frequency range will be 30 megahertz to 3 megahertz, and number of frequency channel will be very high. That will be 65,000 point, and time resolution is approx 1 millisecond. So we will improve our performance by making this FFT spectrograph, and we have started working on that. After that, we will make we will install 3 type of antenna. First is for 40 to 200 megahertz, that is low periodic antenna. Then 10 meter dish for 150 to 600 megahertz, and 5 meter dish for 500 to 2500 megahertz. So we are planning for this project, and we are hoping to finish it very soon. Thank you very much. By this, I end my presentation.
Thank you, Kushagra Upadhyay. Any questions on this talk? Please raise your hands. If not, let's thank the speaker, and let's move on to the next presentation, which is by Bela Dikshit from NCRAT IFR, who is going to present results on the testing of the L-band aperture array beamforming. Bela, are you ready with your talk?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
This is visible. Hello.
No, we can't see your screen still.
Oh,
Please
sorry.
share your screen.
Now?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
We can see your screen. So please proceed. I'll warn you after 10 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thanks. Good evening, all. I'm Bella. I'm going to present our work on the topic of L-band aperture array beamformer, prototype implementation and testing. Actually, this is the part of eGMRT. In eGMRT, there are three new features are there. Add antennas on shorter baseline, which gives us a better imaging of the large scale structure and also improving the overall sensitivity. Second one is to add the antenna on longer baseline, which improves the angular resolution and confusion limit. And third one, which today I will talk on, uh, replace the single pixel feed with the focal plane array, which is a multi-pixel feed up to the 30 independent beam, add and improve the field of view and the sky survey speed. So uh, first, final goal of the final aim of our project is to target the 550 to 850 megahertz band, design a 300 megahertz correlator and beamformer along with 30 independent steerable beam with 16K spectral channels. Uh, we are now we are started with L-band Astron FPA, started with L-band field, which we purchased from the Astron, used for the prototype beamformer at GMRT. Uh, in first figure, this is the focal plane array 8 by 9 element feed, which is this is the VLD element, and frequency range is 1.1 to 1.7 gigahertz, and these elements are closely spaced. The element spacing is 11 centimeter. So signal then after the first stage amplification, we convert this signal into the RF to IF band. We use this double down conversion process, double down conversion unit. Uh, that down conversion unit having the 80 megahertz bandwidth, uh, and we use the free space test range, this uh, setup, to test our beamforming design beamformer. This is the 3-meter reflector with cross dipole at the prime focus, uh, used as an radiator to test the beam steering and the beamformer. This is the focal plane array. After the first stage conversion, we convert this voltage signal into the optical signal. Then it brings place one room where that all digitizer and the processing unit and down conversion units are placed. So again, we convert this optical signal into the electrical form and convert this RF signal into the IF in a baseband signal. And this is the orientation of the focal plane array, feed orientation. This is just we used 64 channel ADC and Roach 1 board for the processing the data. And this is the RF cable connections. And this is just, I want to show the actual look of this board and 64 channel ADC. This is the narrowband beamformer signal flow. First, signal coming from the antenna. First, we digitized it. Bandwidth. This is the 12-bit ADC we are using, but because of resource limitation in Roach 1 board, we are using only 8-bit to up to the FFT. After that, we are using the 4-bit for correlation and the beamforming. This is actually signal coming from this 64 channel ADC is a TDM, time division multiplexing form. So as each time four signal coming on one lay. After the processing, digitization and beamforming, all this processing, it goes to the control PC via 1 GB port. Beamformer and correlator data, it's a integrated data, so it's go through the 1 GB port, and its raw voltage goes through the 10 GB port to the control machine. After that, this is the actual beamformer FPGA design. This is after the digitization, we convert this time domain signal into the frequency domain, and find the correlation. It's nothing but the complex weights for our beamformer. So once we calculated that complex weights, we applied that weights to the beamformer to form the multiple beams using that weights. And in the this beamformer part, we are in this beamforming part, we are adding this we are adding the signal coming from the each antenna after the complex weight multiplication and accumulation MAC operation is performed. And integration time for the correlation is 1.3 second, and for beamformer is 0.6 second. And actual specification for the this correlator and beamformer is we are taking 32 FPA inputs, and bandwidth is 32 megahertz with right now we are forming the 5 beams with 1K spectral channels. Actually, first we tried to design this correlator and beamformer in a single design, but because of resource limitation, we separated out, and we are able to process more number of inputs because of this separation. To form the coherent beam or normal conventional beam, there is only one column or one row of the correlation matrix is sufficient. But we tried some other algorithm also. We want full correlation matrix. Therefore, we again, because of resource limitation, we were not able to perform the whole. We are not able to get the whole correlation matrix in a single design. So we tried some multiplexer approach. So we row by row, by changing the reference element, we take the whole correlation matrix. Here we show here is a correlation measure the correlation matrix. The first one is the magnitude. Here you can see the this values are symmetrical along the diagonal elements, which are expected, and this is the phase which are anti-symmetric to the diagonal. Again, this is the diagonal is a self, therefore it shows the maximum, and here the phase is 0. Then beamformer beam steering. So as shown in this free space test range, we are steering the focal plane array beam across the radiator, and take the beam steering algorithm. Here we radiated at the 1.3 gigahertz at minus 35 dBm, and now measure the beam half power beam width. It's very closer to the expected one. Also, we observe the IRNSS satellite signal using this beam steering algorithm in L5 band. This is the IRNSS 1C. Here you can see this exactly in front of FPA. So we form the beam using the 16 FPA elements, and we are getting this profile, which is the IRNSS 1C. Then this is the max SNR algorithm we tried, which we get some interesting result from that algorithm. There are some steps to get the weights or the complex weights from this algorithm. First, we compute the off source array configuration of off source we are taking here as a off source means off radiation off, and on source is a radiation on. So first we compute the off source array covariance matrix, then the in second step we can compute the on source array covariance matrix, then we calculated the optimal weights using the on source and off source covariance matrices, and apply the weights to the beamformer and acquire the beamformer data on and off, and computed the SNR using the on source minus the off source upon the off source.
Bella, three more minutes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
3 slides remain.
Yeah.
Okay. These are some interesting results. So we have taken the linear array, 4-element linear array. This red one is the max SNR method, and the blue one is the conventional method, means coherent beam. You can see the improvement, SNR improvement in both cases, 4-element and 8-element. And why we are getting the improvement in max SNR? Here we find the reason, because these elements are very closely placed. Therefore, the coupling between two elements affects this. That's why the conventional method is not that much efficient in that case. So here we see in first 1100 megahertz there is less mutual coupling. So coherent and max SNR beam SNR is not much differ. It's not much improvement in max SNR. But here in second plot 200 megahertz, here is mutual coupling is large, and you can see the sufficient improvement in the SNR. And actually in EGMRT our final aim is to 300 megahertz bandwidth with 30 independent beams. That's why we are trying the different platforms. So we are exploring the RFSoC platform ZCU11. So we will get the we can use single board as an down conversion and whole processing unit. So we are exploring that. And finally, I want to acknowledge my all EGMRT project members, Rahul Argade, Sudhir Fakatkar, Hari Haran, Naren, Jayant Roy, Nisim Kanekar, and Yashwant Gupta, and all GMRT groups, backend group, computer group, front end and OFC group, operation group, mechanical group, and electronics and civil group. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Bella. I see one hand up. Kushagra, yeah, please go ahead with your question.
Actually, I have a question regarding that your FPGA design, that you designed FFT core for that. I have a question that which algorithm you used for I think 16,000 channel, right?
No, that's the final beamformer, final correlator will build for 16K channels.
Okay.
Right now we are using only 1K FFT.
Okay.
And
Okay,
you are asking about algorithm.
Right,
so
right.
Here we are using the Casper tool flow. So there are some system generator blocks plus Casper
Okay.
Casper blocks are there. So
Okay,
we
okay.
build a graphical designing.
Okay, fine. So if we want to go for 16,000 channel with Vertex 7 and something, so is it possible in that Casper design, as you are saying?
Yeah, it is possible, but you have to see the resource limitation because there are FFT requires so much computation and resources.
Right. So I think we can go for parallel 16 FFT core, right?
Yeah.
Something like that. If you want to go for 16,000 channel FFT core.
And what exactly you want to miss? I'm not getting your point.
Actually, I want to say that if I have one FPGA board, suppose Vertex 7, and I want to implement a design for 16,000 point FFT, so I mean, what algorithm is suitable with limited resources? the existing design IP code that you are saying, that Casper something, right? So is it this will implement that 16,000 point, or we need to make something else, or we need to?
Actually, this is Casper is system generator based, means graphical programming. So and Casper tool flow take care the all this IP you're talking about, IP and all. So
Right.
you can build 16K design, but you have to check the resource, how much resources. Suppose Vertex
Right,
5
right. I'm
has
getting your point
less
that resources is limited. That's why I'm
limited.
asking that.
That's why we are exploring this RFSoC and other tool, other
Okay,
platforms.
okay, okay.
So
Okay, but actually I made a
Uh,
design for this channel, and using this Jink RFSoC, but in that part I have seen that block memory were taking out of limits. So such problem are occur. So I was just asking that.
Okay,
yeah,
I guess we can continue the. See, we have to move on. We are running out of time, so I would suggest that further discussion you can take over on the Slack channel. Just to remind all the participants that there is a Slack channel, ORT Instrumentation and Technique, under the ASI Slack. So if you want more details or you want to continue this discussion, you are welcome and free to continue it on the Slack. Unfortunately, because of limitation of time, we have to move ahead. So let's thank Bela again, and we move on to the next presentation in the session, which is by Harsha Tanti from IIT Indore, and he is going to provide us an update on the IIT Indore radio interferometers. Harsha. Can you share your presentation, Harsha?
Bella, can you stop sharing?
Bella, can you stop sharing? Hello, Harsha, can you hear me? He is not able to hear anything. So,
Is my sound audible?
yes, we can hear you. What about your presentation? Can
Okay.
you please share your slides?
But I am not able to hear anyone. Okay, fine. I will share my slides. Okay. Are my slides visible?
Yes.
Okay, fine. A very good evening to everyone. I am Harsha, and I am going to talk about the update on ongoing project of IIT Indore radio interferometer. This is primarily being built for educational purposes. This is the outline of today's talk, and here comes the list of team members and ex-members who are currently working in different institutions. This is the first time such kind of project is being done in an academic institution in India, and we received help from several experts from renowned institutes like NCRA, RRI, and IIA, and also from US. So this image shows here the IIRI site. The IIRI is located inside the IIT Indore campus, which is spread around 500 acres, in which we found a 100 cross 100 meter area near the forest side of the campus. The image here shows the picture of entire site having 4 parabolic dish antennas going right to left, A1, A2, A3, and A4. And in the between there is hut of around 20 cross 20 feet in dimension, where all the backend electronics and uh, other PCs and all those things are kept. So, as mentioned earlier, IIRI consists of 4 parabolic reflector antenna with longest baseline of 73 meter, therefore having angular resolution of around 10 arc minute. The F by D ratio of antenna 1 to antenna 3 is 0.4 and antenna 4 is 0.3, because the 3 of these antennas are same type, and the antenna 4 is of different but retrofitted to have the same movement and alignment as A1 to A3. But all the 4 dishes have the diameter of 4.5 meter, therefore giving field of view of around 2.7 degree. The antenna, all the 4 antennas are auto steerable with an accuracy of 90 arc second in both azimuth and elevation direction. This slide shows all the baselines of the 4 antennas, as of them longest being the 73 meter. Now coming to the block diagram of IIRI. IIRI can be modularized in 4 major blocks, like the first one being antenna block, followed by the front-end electronics block, which is then connected to the backend receiver block via coaxial cable. And at the end, we have the digital backend or a correlator, which is implemented on a Roach 2 board. And these all things are kept at the hut, which I've shown in the intro in the slide before. Now coming to the antenna block. The antenna block is mainly consists of 4 parabolic dishes, feeds, and an antenna control system. The antenna control system is used to steer the antenna, which is controlled by a very user-friendly software, which gives a command to the local control panel shown over here to move the steer the antenna wherever we like. And these are the close-up pictures of antenna A1 to A4, where we can see that A4 is a little bit different from the all other 3 antennas. And as for the feeding mechanism, we used VE4MA feeds because of its very almost negligible side lobes and very low gain back lobe, which is around minus 17 dB, which was seen by a CST simulation, and the radiation pattern is over here. And this is the structure of the feed over here. And this also gave the and this here shows the S11 characteristics of the feed, and from this we can see that for our operating frequency range, which is around 1.37 gigahertz to 1.47 gigahertz, the feed is resonant. And before going to this feed, we have also tested and validated the correlated design with using 2.5 meter dishes with rectangular horn feeds and also EP horn antennas. And now coming to the front end block. This consists of LNAs LNAs and some band pass filter, as shown in this schematic. This is the schematic we are implemented for the front end. And this side is the input of it, and this side is the output. And the picture over here shows the assembly of the antenna feed and the front end near to the antenna feed. and this picture over here shows the actual arrangement of the front end. So at the back end, we used a super heterodyne receiver, one stage super heterodyne receiver, where we have a high gain amplifiers at the front. Then we gave a local oscillator to down convert the frequency from RF to IF, so that it can go into ADC. Yeah. And this is the current design we are implementing in the IRI setup. So now coming and this picture shows the on the left we can see the Roach 2 board. In this we have implemented the FX correlator design, and on the right we have the heterodyne receiver. Now at the end we have, as I mentioned, that we have a correlated design on Roach board. This is the block diagram of 2-element and 4-element correlated design which we implemented. And the 2-element interferometer design was taken from the Casper tutorials. Yes, and from that, based on that, we designed a 4-element FX correlator. So this was thanks to our X team members Bela and Nikita. So that this design was finalized, and working of this design was confirmed by testing and validation rig we set up and we set up at IIT Indore. And okay, the main challenges in the 4-element interferometer correlator design was to synchronize the ADC delay of the Roach board.
3
Now,
more minutes, please.
Coming to the testing and validation part, as I mentioned earlier, that we tested the 2 and 4-element correlator design. So this is the schematics of the RF's circuitry. Like this on the left we have the front end, and for right we have a back end RF, which is a super heterodyne receiver used for the testing and validation of the correlator design. And from many observation, we found that for each of the for the mentioned baseline over in the table here, we observed that the observed fringe width was very near to the theoretical one which we calculated for the sun drift scans. And so 4-element correlator design was working properly, as for such a non calibrated system, we are getting fringe values who's very near to the theoretically calculated one. And this here shows the setup for the validation and testing of for the correlator design. It's just like a backyard interferometer thing. So these are the fringe plots for from the 4-element correlator. Okay, so these are the fringe plot we got from the validation design. So first row shows the cross phase design, which is showing us the fringes is, and the second row shows the cross power in dB scale, in which we can see the sun is coming in the beam and going out of the beam. And coming back to the block diagram. So right now we have all 4 antennas set up, and we have tested the front end and back end at lab, and we are right now assembling everything to get things going. And as for the future plans, we will be doing on-sun off-sun tests. Then we will start the interferometer. Thereafter, we will perform calibration using artificial and also the known calibrators. Then we will do experiments like generating an image using known sources like Cassiopeia A, Cygnus A, and SkyMap. And in the future, we will try to replace all the amplifiers and other components which we used as a which we have used a readily available thing with a customized component made by students. Thank you.
Thanks, Harsha. Unfortunately, we are running a little bit late, so we don't have time for questions, but I encourage anyone who wants to ask questions to please make use of the Slack channel. So we will move on to the next and the last presentation of this session, which is by Mr. Dorje Angchuk from Indian Institute of Astrophysics, who would tell us about upgrading an old 50-centimeter telescope for the robotic operation, current status, and the plans for future.
Hi all, is my screen visible?
Yes, it is, and we can hear you. So I'll
thank you.
Give you a warning after 10 minutes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi all, good evening. I'm Dorje Angchuk from Indian Institute of Astrophysics. First of all, I would like to thank the SOC team for inviting me to present upgrading an old 50-centimeter telescope for the robotic operation, the current status, and the plan for the future. Just a moment. What happened? Okay, the effort and the team. Basically, I would also like to thank all my team members who have worked dedicatedly in the fixed timeline, in the harsh weather condition and difficult time to get this telescope in operation and getting some result. These are our team members, which includes electronics, computers, mechanical, observation, and we had actually put the telescope in the big winter period of February in Hanle. The telescope itself, this telescope was initially installed in collaboration with McDonald Science for Space Science, Washington University, and it was planned to operate 2.5 meter F10 Cassegrain telescope for monitoring the active galactic agents. So one of this telescope was installed here at Hanle in the year 2004. And the other is in Arizona, and together they would, by 180-degree apart, they would constitute the antipodal transient observatory. The specification are, this is made by Taurus Incorporation. The optics are Ritchie Criterion F10 0.5 meter and equatorial mount telescope. Basically, I would like to address what actually happened. The problems with the telescope is that the telescope had suffered a huge dent in the RA drive during transportation, and the same was affecting the tracking while the telescope was traversing the zenith. The deck axis used to oscillate at random position, which was difficult to map. The primary mirror mounting of the telescope was pretty loose, thus destabilizing the mirror. The motion controller board hardware was absolute. The firmware as well as the source code was not available to us. The third-party high-level software OCAS was having difficulty integrating with the CSIMC controller. All this combined problem was making it difficult for us to reverse engineer the telescope and get the same in operation. So in November 2019, we decided to take the challenge of upgrading a 50-centimeter telescope, converting it back to a full-fledged robotic telescope, which can be used for many science programs. All the optomechanical problems were identified, and it was decided to develop a new control system using inexpensively readily available electronics. So these were our aims and objectives. The 50-centimeter telescope actually served as a perfect test bed for the testing the skills of engineers at IO, and they have done a very good job. The aim was to refurbish the telescope in a fixed timeline. The prime requirement was to keep it budget friendly. We had incorporated the already available hardware and optics with the telescope. IO Hanle being remote and with the harsh weather condition prevailing, we want to optimize the telescope for robotic operation. Since there was a lot of telescope user for transit object, our intention was to develop keeping the same in mind. Considering the requirement of a fast telescope for transient object, we opted for a roll of roof dome design. And the highlights of this project are that the controller is built on an efficient, low-cost, programmable system on chip PSOC equipped with 32-bit Cortex M3 processor. It has a robust and indigenous closed-loop PID motion profile control algorithm, which ensured very precise position and velocity loop otherwise seen in large telescope only. The controller is developed in a very generic way so that it can be used in any mid-sized telescopes. The control algorithm for subsystems like the focus with filter, dome enclosure, temperature, etc. is also incorporated. An indigenous pointing model program was written and implemented for the same low-cost yet efficient TCS and OCS residing in one easy-to-use interface has been developed, integrating all aspects of robotic operation. The pointing accuracy was found to be around 2 arc-minute was achieved with coarse pointing model. The sliving speed of 10 degree per arc second is achievable with the current setup. Unguided tracking accuracy up to 5 minutes was tested with constant tracking, which was done at Leh while in the test setup. So better tracking to be can be achieved, and the plans is still in progress, and the implementation and with the implementation of repeated pointing during tracking, we will be able to achieve. Though we have done the repeated pointing during tracking at Leh, but due to the shortage of time, we could not incorporate the same in the limited time frame after installing it here at Hanle. So this is the timeline. So all the actual project started around April 20, and then most of the time from next 5 months was spent in the laboratory developing each and everything, and it was done in the basement of Leh office. And then we sometime in October we took out the telescope for sky testing at Leh. And in the last week of January, we transported the telescope to Hanle where it was tested, and and we were able to show some result. Basically, this slide shows the control architecture, basically the block diagram. And ours is actually a distributed control system where we have 3 microcontrollers. The master controller is controlled is connected to the TCS through an RS-232 port, and the slave nodes, 2 slave nodes are connected to a CAN bus, and the one slave node is dedicated to the RA drive, and the second slave node is dedicated to the DEC drive. The other auxiliary subsystem like the filter wheel, focus, temperature are connected to the master controller because they don't take much of the processor time. And all the control signals from all these axes are driven through step and direction. Next slide. We have implemented the proportional and integral time of the PID control system here. So in our case, we have 2 feedback. That is, one is the position feedback, and the second is the velocity feedback. So the position feedback is from the encoder is processed every 1 millisecond encoder loop, while as the servo loop is done in every 10 milliseconds. So the command from the TCS is given to the command processor, which calculates and determines the predetermined time, which includes the acceleration time, constant time, deacceleration time, and the time taken for the to reach the destination. And then with the instantaneous motion profile time, it is the output is fed to the PID control system, and the output of the PID control system is given to the PID pulse generator, which then gives the pulse and direction, which is fed to the servo amplifier, and the same is connected to the motor and encoder. We don't have a current loop here. So the equation of motion was derived by Sonam-Dürfeld from the three basic laws of Newton. And then here in this case, the trapezoidal motion profile and the triangular motion profile are showing in the graphical form, where T1 in the trapezoidal is the acceleration time, the constant, and the deceleration time, while as in case of short movement, we only have the triangular profile is implemented, where T1 is equal to T2. We have here in this case, the Ziegler-Nicholas tuning rule was followed for gain optimization. Current operation of the telescope is done with different sets of gain. In here, before sleeping, we have the proportional constant as 10.9 and the integral constant is 0.3, and the velocity value is set again is set at 13103.2 counts per second, which is equivalent to 2 degrees per second, and the acceleration is divided by 10. Similarly, for tracking, the Kp is 40 and the integral constant is 0.02. The acceleration in this case is 54.597, and the velocity is 50, and acceleration is divided by 2. This is the schematic of the controller board and the picture of the controller board that we have developed. This is how we have housed the telescope, the controller board on the telescope. This is the RA controller board is mounted on the telescope, while as the deck board is controller board is mounted on the yoke of the telescope. The polycarbonate is used to house for weather protection as well as monitoring during the testing. Soon we will, once it is finalized, we will be changing it to more so that there won't be any light coming out of due to the LEDs. So the telescope control system. The TCS is developed on Qt C++ framework for coordinate conversion, correction, communication with the controller, necessary mount and sensor display, data logging, control of subsystem like focus, filter wheel enclosure, and hosting a TCP/IP server for robotic telescope control. The order of transformation vital to convert a star coordinate catalog position to the observed position falls in 2 steps. That is, the first is from mean to the apparent, and the second is from the apparent to the observed place. The mean to the apparent involves precision, nutation, annual aberration, correction, etc. While as the apparent to the observed place, it involves geographical location as atmospheric location correction, and the same. And after that, the pointing model correction is applied, and the resultant is fed to the motor master controller, where it is given to the telescope axis. So the observatory control system is also residing in the same one, along with the TCS in the same user interface. So here, with the help of a master controller, we can connect to different subsystems like the focuser, filter wheel, dome enclosure, rain sensor, temperature sensor, etc. And we can also control a USB control CCTV camera for robotic operation through the observatory control system. This is a screenshot of the observatory control system that has been developed in-house. And here we can see the catalog of different stars which can be provided. And on the right bottom, we have the different display like the home sensor limit, etc., and the array counts, encoder displays. The next slide, here we have the go-to where we can see the location, azimuth and elevation location of the telescope. The third thing here we can, in this, you can see in the right box, we can do all the focusing. And the fourth one, we can place the filter wherever it is intended. Okay. So the pointing.
You have 2 more minutes. You have 2 more minutes.
Sure. Okay. Amit Shukla is entered the waiting room. So I think somebody has to admit it, but that screen was coming. Actually, we've developed the pointing model software wherein we have employed two methods. There is one which is the manual method is employed when the model star is not in the telescope field of view. This is during the initial part of the observation. So we manually center the star and log the object coordinate and telescope coordinate, and we generate the model and fit the data and save the coefficients. And we have the others method too, that is we can capture the CCD image, log the object coordinates, and then we can plate solve and compute the angular distance to the center of the image and generate a model and fit the data and find the coefficient. So this is the graphical user interface. So both this we can choose the manual or the plate solve through this user interface, and we can instantaneously plot the post-fleet data. This is just an indication only. The pointing, we could do only coarse pointing model after bringing it here and installation in the last 1 or 2 weeks. So the pointing performance while in the test setup at Leh, the controller level for our angle, we were having like around 1 arc second RMS, and for the deck on the left side, on the left side, we have this for deck. It was coming around 2 or more arc second error. And after doing the pointing model at Leh setup, which was not a firm base, and the platform was very flimsy, we could get then the error in the deck around 2 arc minutes, and in the hour angle, we were able to get 4 to 6 arc minutes pointing error. So the role of roof enclosure design, the role of roof enclosure was chosen for the robotic 50 centimeter, considering its simplicity. It can give a free field of view, or thus bringing out the time for any transient object. It will also provide protection from weathering. It will be fabricated in the form of skeletal framework of 2 by 2 square pipe section, and will be cladded with a galvanized sheet. The entire structure will come in 2 sections. The upper section will be retractable and will be driven by chain sprocket mechanism. We have completed the civil work for the beam and foundation structure in November 2022, and the telescope can be seen installed on the pier, which is the dome fabrication will, because of the seasonal work here, will start in May 2021, and it's expected to complete it in all robotic aspect by in June 2021. So these are some of the results that we got in the last few days in a limited time. The first row images are the single exposure, and it's taken from 32nd for Orion, and we have a stack image of M47, and the CCD images of Sumbero Galaxy for 200 second, and the Whirlpool Galaxy for 200 second can be shown. In case of the pointing, here we can see we have provided in the top right 200 second pinpoint images are coming, while as in a 10-minute exposure, you can clearly see the trailing in the images. This was taken a few days back, and these are the rear and the contour plots of the from the telescope data, and the future plans. We want to make it fully robotic. Then we are doing a script for robotic operation, which include integrated control of the telescope, focus, filter wheel, and many sensors. Autofocus loop check and CCD control from its SDK before every observation night. Automatic data pipelining which include image subtraction reduction, photometry after every run. All the script will be done in Python, and it will be hosted in the TCS. And the future plan also includes pointing model software with astrometry, which we will be doing soon. And in case the guiding doesn't improve, then we also want to implement the tracking with pointing model, as well as auto guiding if necessary later on. But I don't think that will be necessary. So in the coming future, we believe we can universalize our controller hardware and the software, so that it can be used by many small to medium size commercial telescope purchased by many university and institution, but not working due to some issues in their controller. So these are some of the reference. And before I say thank you, I would like to encourage everybody to visit the posters of Sonam Jorpel, Chawang Tanzin, and Chawang Dorje. And they have done incredible work, and you will definitely get more details in the same. Thank you very much, and wishing you clear skies and abundance of photo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dorje Angchuk. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. It's a very interesting piece of work which you presented. One would have liked to continue with questions, but I am also mindful that there is a general body meeting which is about to start, and we have certainly run out of time. So, this was the last talk of the session. So we end this session here, and we end this session by thanking all the speakers for very interesting work which was presented today. And best of luck and best of wishes.